Though the dining room saw no actual violence, the chilling silence that fell over it was far more menacing. Federal agents were completely baffled by a secret left behind on a single crumpled napkin at table 4. Ultimately, it was an exhausted 22-year-old waitress who decoded the terrifying message, thwarting an international assassination just as dessert was being served. Friday nights at the Wellington were a theater of power and excess. Located in the beating heart of Manhattan's financial district, the restaurant was a fortress of dark mahogany, imported Italian marble and crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, expensive glow over the city's elite. Politicians, hedge fund managers, and foreign dignitaries paid thousands of dollars just to secure a booth in the private dining wing. Ellie Bennett was intimately familiar with this world, though she didn't belong to it. A 22-year-old graduate student at Georgetown University, she worked exhausting double shifts as a waitress to keep her head above the crushing weight of her student loans. She was brilliant, studying historical linguistics and Cold War ciphertexts. But tonight, her only concern was making sure the dry-aged Wagyu was served at exactly medium rare. At 7:30 p.m., the atmosphere in the private wing shifted. The low hum of jazz and clinking silverware was suddenly swallowed by a heavy, suffocating tension. Richard, the notoriously strict floor manager, practically sprinted into the wait station. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he grabbed Ellie by the shoulder. "Table 4, Richard whispered, his voice tight. "Christian Blake just walked in. You're on him tonight. No mistakes, Ellie." "None." Ellie felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Everyone knew Christian Blake. The media called him the Russian billionaire. Though born in Chicago, Blake had made a ruthless multi-billion-dollar fortune in the 1990s by buying up Siberian oil fields during the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was a ghost, a man who rarely appeared in public, surrounded by whispers of organized crime, government corruption, and dangerous enemies. Taking a deep breath, Ellie smoothed her apron, picked up a silver tray of sparkling water, and walked out to the private dining alcove. When she approached table 4, her instincts immediately screamed that something was wrong. Christian Blake was a man known for his commanding presence, but the man sitting at the head of the table looked like a prisoner. He was wearing a custom Tom Ford suit, but his skin was a sickly, ashen grey. A sheen of cold sweat glistened on his forehead, and his eyes darted around the room with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. He wasn't alone. 3 men sat with him. They didn't look like business associates, and they certainly didn't look like standard private security. They wore plain dark suits that fit poorly across their broad, muscular shoulders. Their eyes were dead, scanning the room with chilling, mechanical precision. "Good evening, gentlemen," Ellie said, forcing a warm, practiced smile. "Welcome to the Wellington. May I start you off with some sparkling water, or perhaps a cocktail?" One of the men, a towering figure with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, raised his hand. He didn't even look at Ellie. "Water. We will order the food now. 4 steaks. Rare. Bring the most expensive Bordeaux you have. Leave the bottle." His English was perfect, but the cadence was flat and devoid of any emotion. Ellie nodded, quickly pouring the water. As she leaned in to fill Christian Blake's glass, she noticed his hands. They were resting on the heavy white tablecloth, shaking violently. His knuckles were bone white. For a fraction of a second, the billionaire locked eyes with her. The look in his eyes wasn't just fear. It was sheer, unadulterated terror. "Right away, sir," Ellie murmured, stepping back. For the next hour, Ellie watched the table closely. It was the most bizarre dinner service she had ever witnessed. The 3 men ate their bloody steaks in total unbroken silence. They didn't discuss business, they didn't toast, they simply ate, their eyes fixed firmly on Blake. Blake, on the other hand, didn't touch a single bite of his food. He continuously wiped his sweating brow with a heavy cloth napkin. Every time he shifted in his seat, the man with the scar subtly moved his hand beneath his jacket, resting it near his waistband. They were carrying concealed weapons. Ellie was sure of it, at exactly 8:35 p.m. Christian Blake dropped his silver fork. It clattered loudly against the porcelain plate, falling onto the floor. "My apologies," Blake muttered, his voice hoarse and trembling. He bent down to retrieve it. As he dipped beneath the table out of the immediate sightline of his three captors, Ellie saw a flash of silver. A heavy Mont Blanc pen. He was frantically scribbling something on his spare cocktail napkin, pressing so hard the ink nearly tore through the fragile paper. He sat back up, breathing heavily. He placed the crumpled napkin directly under the base of his empty wine glass. Suddenly the man with the scar stood up. "We are leaving," he announced abruptly. He threw a stack of crisp $100 bills onto the table, more than enough to cover the exorbitant check and a massive tip. "But you haven't finished," Ellie started to say, stepping forward. "We are leaving," the man repeated, stepping right into Ellie's personal space. The sheer malice radiating off him made her breath hitch in her throat. Without another word, the three men grabbed Christian Blake by the arms, practically lifting the billionaire out of his chair, and marched him out the back exit of the restaurant. Ellie stood frozen in the middle of the dining room. The scent of seared wagyu and expensive wine lingered in the air, but the table felt like a crime scene. Her eyes slowly drifted down to the base of the wine glass, where the crumpled cocktail napkin sat waiting. She walked over and pulled it free. Ellie smoothed the wrinkled napkin flat against her serving tray. She expected to see a desperate plea for help, a phone number, a name, or perhaps a simple "call 911." Instead, the paper was covered in chaotic, jagged scratches. To the untrained eye, it looked like the meaningless doodles of a drunk man. It was a chaotic mess of loops, sharp angles, and bizarre symbols that didn't resemble any standard alphabet. Richard appeared beside her, letting out a heavy sigh of relief. "Thank God they're gone," he muttered, wiping his brow. "Those guys gave me the creeps. Clean the table, Ellie. We have a senator's party coming in 15 minutes. He glanced down at the napkin in her hands and scoffed. "What is that gibberish? Throw it in the trash." "Wait," Ellie whispered, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs. She pulled the napkin closer to her face, her eyes narrowing as the overhead chandelier illuminated the blue ink. It wasn't gibberish. During her extensive studies at Georgetown, Ellie had spent a year specifically analyzing intercepted Soviet communications from the 1980s. What the average person didn't know about the Russian language was that its cursive form, specifically the shorthand used by older generations, looks absolutely nothing like the printed Cyrillic alphabet. It looks like a continuous, unreadable string of loops. But this wasn't even standard Russian cursive. This was a highly localized phonetic shorthand, a specific dialect of tachygraphy, used almost exclusively by Soviet-era industrialists to keep their notes secret from standard government auditors. It was a code. And because Christian Blake had spent the formative years of his career navigating the treacherous, blood-soaked oil fields of Siberia in the 90s, it was the only code his brain instinctively reached for in a moment of pure panic. Because of her hyper-specific academic background, Ellie was perhaps one of the only people in a 5-mile radius who could actually read it. Her lips moved silently as she mentally translated the jagged loops, converting the phonetic shorthand into standard Cyrillic and then into English. Daughter taken. Ellie's breath hitched. She read the next line. Rigged main gas line. Basement. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she deciphered the final heavily underlined scratch at the bottom of the napkin. Detonation at 2100. Ellie whipped her head toward the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining room. It was 8:42 p.m. 18 minutes. "Richard!" Ellie gasped, grabbing her manager's arm, her fingernails dug into his suit jacket. "Richard, you have to evacuate the restaurant right now. Call the police." Richard yanked his arm away, looking at her like she had lost her mind. "Excuse me. Evacuate Ellie. We have 300 people in this building. We have the mayor of Chicago in the main dining room. I am not ruining a $50,000 dinner service because a billionaire doodled on a napkin. It's not a doodle." Ellie practically screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "It's a bomb threat. He's being held hostage, and they rigged the gas line downstairs. It's going to blow in 18 minutes. "You're hysterical." Richard snapped his face, turning red with anger. "Get back to work before I fire you on the spot." Ellie looked around the crowded restaurant. People were laughing, clinking champagne flutes, slicing into expensive steaks, completely oblivious to the fact that they were sitting on top of a massive explosive. She looked back at the clock. 8:44 p.m. There was no time to explain linguistics. There was no time to argue. "I'm sorry, Richard," Ellie whispered. Before he could react, Ellie dropped her silver tray. It hit the marble floor with a deafening crash, shattering crystal glasses and sending water flying everywhere. As Richard jumped back in shock, Ellie sprinted past him, darting through the crowded dining room toward the kitchen doors. Right next to the kitchen entrance, secured behind a thin piece of glass, was the restaurant's emergency fire alarm. Without hesitating, Ellie ripped off her high-heeled shoe and smashed the heel directly into the glass. The glass shattered, cutting her hand, but she didn't care. She reached in and pulled the heavy red lever down with all her strength. Instantly, a piercing, ear-splitting siren erupted through the entire building. Strobing white lights flashed from the ceiling, plunging the elegant dining room into utter chaos. "Fire!" Ellie screamed at the top of her lungs, waving her arms frantically. "Everyone get out. Leave everything and run now." The panic was immediate. Chairs were knocked over as wealthy patrons, politicians, and socialites scrambled toward the exits in a desperate stampede. Waiters dropped trays of food, sprinting for the doors. Richard was screaming her name, threatening her with a lawsuit, but Ellie ignored him, aggressively ushering terrified guests out onto the cold Manhattan sidewalk. By 8:51 p.m., the restaurant was completely empty. 2 minutes later, the wail of police sirens pierced the night air. Half a dozen NYPD cruisers skidded to a halt outside the Wellington, followed closely by the heavy armored trucks of the NYPD bomb squad. Ellie stood shivering on the sidewalk, clutching her bleeding hand, still holding the crumpled napkin. Special Agent Jonathan Crawford from the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force was the first to approach her, flashing his badge. "Who pulled the alarm? Where is the fire?" he demanded, looking at the untouched building. "There's no fire," Ellie said, her voice shaking as she handed him the napkin. "It's a bomb, connected to the main gas line in the basement. They took Christian Blake." Crawford looked at the napkin, then at Ellie, his eyes narrowing in intense skepticism. "This is a prank, kid. This is literally just scribbles." "It's Soviet shorthand," Ellie fired back, her adrenaline spiking. "It's a phonetic cipher. Send your men down to the basement right now. Look at the main gas intake valve. Please, you have exactly 6 minutes." Something in Ellie's unwavering, desperate tone made Crawford pause. He tapped his radio. "Captain Hughes, take a team to the basement. Check the main gas intake. Proceed with extreme caution." The next 5 minutes were the longest of Ellie's life. The crowd of evacuated patrons murmured angrily from behind the police barricades. Richard stood a few feet away, glaring daggers at her, already on the phone with the restaurant's owner preparing to have her arrested for inciting a panic. At exactly 8:58 p.m., Agent Crawford's radio crackled to life. It was Captain Hughes. His voice, usually calm and authoritative, was tight with raw fear. "Crawford," the radio hissed. "Clear the block. I repeat, clear the entire damn block right now." Crawford's face went completely pale. "Hughes, what are you looking at?" "Military-grade C4, Hughes replied over the static. "Wired directly into the high-pressure gas main. If this goes off, it won't just take out the restaurant. It's going to level the entire city block. We need the disposal unit down here yesterday. Timer is sitting at 90 seconds. Crawford slowly lowered the radio, looking at the 22-year-old waitress standing in front of him. If she hadn't pulled that alarm, 300 people, including half the city's political elite, would be dead in exactly 1 minute and a half. "Kid," Crawford breathed his eyes wide. "Who the hell are you?" But Ellie wasn't listening. She was staring down at the bottom edge of the napkin, at a faint, barely legible string of numbers Christian Blake had managed to scratch out at the very last second. It wasn't a time. It was a license plate number. The bomb was real, but the billionaire and his daughter were still out there, and the men who took them were driving right into a trap. Sirens wailed in a deafening chorus, their flashing red and blue lights bleeding across the wet Manhattan pavement. Ellie stood frozen behind the heavy steel of a police barricade, the icy wind coming off the Hudson River, biting through her thin cotton waitress blouse. Her hands were still trembling, her palms slick with a cold sweat that smelled faintly of copper and fear. Agent Crawford pressed his earpiece deep into his ear, his jaw locked so tight the muscles twitched under his skin. "Talk to me, Hughes," Crawford barked into his radio, his voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the evacuated street. "Give me a status." Static hissed. Then the heavy, ragged breathing of Captain Hughes echoed through the speaker. "Wire is cut. Primary detonator is isolated. We have exactly 12 seconds left on the digital timer, Crawford. 12 seconds. If this girl hadn't pulled that fire alarm when she did, we'd all be vaporized meat right now." Crawford slowly exhaled a visible cloud of white breath in the chilling night air. He looked down at Ellie, his eyes entirely stripped of their previous skepticism. He didn't see a 22-year-old college student anymore. He saw an intelligence asset who had just prevented the deadliest domestic terror attack of the decade. "The license plate," Crawford said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent gravel. He held up the crumpled cocktail napkin. "Read it to me again, exactly as it's written." Ellie leaned forward, squinting under the harsh glare of a street lamp. She traced her index finger over the jagged blue indentations where Christian Blake had nearly torn through the cheap paper with his pen. "It's a New York plate, JRX 9241. But Agent Crawford, there's more here. Below the plate number." Crawford frowned, shining his tactical flashlight onto the napkin. "More shorthand. It just looks like ink blots." "It's not," Ellie insisted, her mind racing back to the dusty archives of Georgetown's linguistics library. Blake's hands were shaking, but the strokes are deliberate. "It's an old financial routing cipher. During the late 80s, corrupt Soviet officials used phonetic symbols to hide offshore banking transfers from state auditors. Blake isn't just being kidnapped for ransom. They are forcing him to liquidate his entire decentralized portfolio." Crawford immediately keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I need an emergency trace on New York plate, Juliet Romeo X-ray Niner 241, black SUV, and get me the Cybercrimes Division on the line." 10 seconds later, dispatch crackled back. "Agent Crawford, we have an ALPR ping on your vehicle. It crossed an automated license plate reader on the FDR drive 3 minutes ago. Heading northbound. Estimated destination is New Jersey." Likely the George Washington Bridge. They're taking him to an airport. Crawford realized his eyes narrowing. Teterboro. It's the only place you can get a private jet off the ground with zero federal oversight if you pay off the right people. Crawford grabbed Ellie by the arm, not forcefully, but with a desperate need for her expertise. I need you in my truck. Right now. I'm a waitress. Ellie stammered the reality of the situation, crashing down on her as she looked at her stained apron. I'm not a cop. You're the only person on this seaboard who can read this billionaire's mind right now. Crawford countered, pulling open the heavy armored door of his black FBI Suburban. The interior smelled of gun oil, stale black coffee, and worn leather. Get in. We have a girl to save. Ellie climbed into the back seat, the heavy door slamming shut behind her, with a metallic thud that sealed out the noise of the city. Crawford jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the SUV into gear. The tires shrieked against the asphalt as they tore away from the curb, merging onto the FDR drive at nearly 90 miles an hour. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, Ellie smoothed the napkin over her knee. The vibrations of the heavy engine hummed through her boots. She focused on the final string of symbols. Agent Crawford. Ellie said, her voice steadying as her academic training took over. The money isn't going to Russia. The routing prefix. It's domestic. It's pointing to a shell corporation in Delaware. This isn't a foreign mob hit. Crawford glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed. What are you saying? I'm saying whoever took Christian Blake knows exactly how to manipulate his public image. Ellie explained the pieces, snapping together in her mind. Everyone assumes Blake is tied to the Russian underworld because of his oil deals in the 90s. If he dies tonight, the FBI will spend the next 10 years chasing ghosts in Moscow. But this cipher, it's directing billions of dollars to a domestic hedge fund. Crawford gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. Arthur Davies. Ellie looked up. Who? Davies is a Wall Street predator. Crawford spat, aggressively, swerving around a slow-moving semi-truck. He used to be Blake's primary investor, until Blake found out Davies was actively bribing federal judges to bankrupt his competitors. Blake was scheduled to testify before a congressional oversight committee next week to expose the whole damn systemic corruption ring. Davies must have hired ex-military contractors to play the part of Russian mobsters. It's a false flag. The Suburban tore across the George Washington Bridge, the massive steel cables flashing by in the darkness. They were descending into the industrial sprawl of New Jersey. If Davies gets that money transferred, Crawford muttered, his eyes locked on the road, he's going to put a bullet in Blake's head and disappear the daughter forever. We have to beat them to the tarmac. The air at Teterboro Airport was thick with the suffocating chemical stench of jet fuel and the humid fog rolling off the nearby swamplands. Crawford's armored Suburban crashed right through the chain-link security gate of Signature Flight Support, a highly exclusive private aviation terminal where billionaires paid millions for absolute anonymity. Dead ahead, sitting on the wet tarmac under blinding halogen floodlights, was a sleek black Gulfstream G650. Its massive twin engines were already spooling up, emitting a high-pitched, bone-rattling whine that made Ellie's teeth ache. "Tactical teams are 2 minutes out," Crawford yelled over the roar of the engines, slamming the Suburban into park, right across the jet's taxiway, completely blocking its path. "Stay in the truck, Ellie. Lock the doors." Crawford kicked his door open, drawing his standard-issue Glock, and stepped out into the blinding light. Through the bulletproof glass of the SUV, Ellie watched the terrifying scene unfold. Standing near the base of the plane's motorized stairs was Arthur Davies. He looked entirely out of place for a kidnapping, dressed in an immaculate camel hair overcoat, his silver hair perfectly styled. Standing beside him were 2 local Port Authority police officers. They weren't there to arrest him. They were standing guard. Davies had bought them just like he bought the judges, and there, being dragged toward the stairs by the scarred mercenary from the restaurant, was Christian Blake. The billionaire looked utterly defeated. Blood trickled down his chin from a fresh cut on his jaw. "Drop the weapon, federal agent!" Crawford roared, aiming his pistol directly at the scarred man's chest. Davies merely smiled, a cold, arrogant expression that dripped with untouchable privilege. He whispered something to the corrupt Port Authority cops, who immediately raised their shotguns and aimed them right at Crawford. "You're out of your jurisdiction," Agent Davies shouted over the engine noise. "This is a private terminal, and Mr. Blake is willingly boarding his own aircraft." "Where is Lily?" Blake screamed, his voice cracking with pure agony. He fought against the mercenary's iron grip. "You promised me I initiated the transfer. Where is my daughter?" "She's safe, Christian," Davies lied smoothly. "Get on the plane." Inside the SUV, Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked down at the napkin one last time. There was one final tiny marking near the edge of the paper, a symbol that didn't belong to the financial cipher. It was a crude drawing of a square with frost lines radiating from it. Cold box. Ellie scanned the tarmac. Her eyes darted past the Gulf Stream, past the fueling trucks landing on a white, unmarked airport catering truck parked 50 yards away in the shadows near the hangars. A thick padlock secured the back rolling door. The truck's refrigeration unit was humming loudly. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the police radio from the center console, pressing the transmit button. "Crawford," Ellie screamed into the mic. "The catering truck, the white one in the shadows. Lily isn't on the plane. She's in the cold box." Crawford didn't look back, but he heard her loud and clear in his earpiece. His eyes locked onto the scarred mercenary. Before Davies could issue another order, a fleet of 6 black FBI tactical vans swarmed onto the tarmac from all directions, their sirens screaming. Heavily armed SWAT operators poured out instantly, outmanning the corrupt local cops, who immediately dropped their shotguns and raised their hands in cowardly surrender. Crawford didn't wait. He sprinted toward the catering truck, 2 SWAT members flanking him. He pulled a pair of heavy bolt cutters from his tactical vest and snapped the thick steel padlock. He threw open the rolling door. A cloud of freezing white vapor spilled out into the humid night air. Inside, shivering violently amidst stacked crates of champagne and caviar, was an 8-year-old girl bound with zip ties. "We got her!" Crawford yelled across the tarmac. "The girl is secure." The moment Blake heard those words, a primal, violent energy surged through his exhausted body. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, the billionaire ripped his arm free from the mercenary's grip and drove his elbow squarely into the man's shattered nose. The mercenary stumbled backward, dropping his weapon, and was instantly tackled to the asphalt by 3 federal agents. Arthur Davies tried to run up the stairs of the jet, his arrogant facade completely shattering, but Crawford was faster. The FBI agent grabbed Davies by the collar of his expensive coat, hurling him down onto the wet tarmac and slamming his hands behind his back. "Hard karma, Davies," Crawford growled, securing the steel handcuffs. "You're done." 10 minutes later, the deafening engines of the Gulf Stream were finally shut down. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicles painted the tarmac in a chaotic strobe of red and blue. Ellie stepped slowly out of the armored Suburban, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. She wrapped her arms around herself, watching as paramedics wrapped a thick thermal blanket around Lily. Christian Blake knelt in the puddles of the tarmac, holding his daughter so tightly it looked as though he would never let her go. Tears streamed down the billionaire's face, washing away the blood and grime. Eventually Blake stood up. He walked slowly past the arrested mercenaries, past the handcuffed, defeated figure of Arthur Davies, and stopped directly in front of Ellie. For a long moment, the man who had built an empire in the frozen wastelands of Siberia, a man who intimidated world leaders, just looked at the exhausted 22-year-old waitress. "Agent Crawford told me what you did." Blake said, his voice a thick emotional rasp. He looked at her apron, then at her bleeding hand, wrapped hastily in gauze. "You understood the cipher. You knew they were going to blow the gas line." "I study historical linguistics," Ellie said softly, offering a weak, trembling smile. "You have terrible handwriting, Mr. Blake." A genuine, breathless laugh escaped Blake's chest. "I owe you my life. I owe you my daughter's life. Tomorrow morning I am paying off every cent of your student loans. And then I am going to offer you a job. I need people who can see the truth, hidden in plain sight. We are going to dismantle the financial networks that men like Davies use to ruin this country. Are you in?" Ellie looked at the ruined, crumpled napkin still clutched in her hand. She thought about the grueling double shifts, the endless struggle, and the corrupt men who thought they could buy their way out of anything. She looked back up at the billionaire. "I'm in." What would you do if a billionaire's life rested entirely in your hands? Ellie's incredible ability to spot the truth hidden in plain sight saved hundreds of lives and brought down a corrupt, untouchable empire. If this heart-stopping story of quick thinking and unimaginable courage kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Share this video with your friends who love real-life mysteries, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, unbelievable true stories.